Welcome, everybody, to this Radicalized Truth Survives breaker. We have some very important global breaking news. We have our very dear friend Sian Norris zooming into us from the UK. Sian, everybody knows, is somebody that I've written extensively with, tons and tons of reporting on the lead up to Roe, warning everybody about all the underlying racism, misogyny, everything. We were trying to be as loud as we possibly could. And Sian has written an incredibly brilliant book called Bodies Under Siege. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And just true confessions. For the last 30 years, I've been reading books from back to front, not always, but often. And I just want to start with a paragraph of yours that you summarize the book with, and then we're going to go in from there. These are Sian's incredible words. We have reached a crossroads between fascism and a new progressive future with a new economic and societal model that will meet the challenges of climate crisis and the rise of artificial intelligence. The choice is urgent. Go one way, and women's, LGBTIQ, and Black and minority ethnic people's lives will be blighted by oppression, forced to dodge hate, and trying to resist genocide. Choose the other way, and the future is ours. I mean, mic drop, getting so many chills right now, but this is what this conversation is going to be about, why people need to choose the other way so we can ensure our future. We're bringing you in today because Uganda just passed the most egregious anti-gay legislation in the world. There was another death related to women's health care rights in Poland. Why don't you bring us up to speed on some of the important global incidences, and then talk about how that ties into Bodies Under Siege?
Well, thank you so much. It's really nice to be back, and it's nice to hear the words from the end of the book. This feels like it was such a long process writing it, and you kind of like to hear it again in like from a different perspective is really, oh yeah, no, that's
right.
That's why we're doing this. So yeah, as you mentioned, we've had a few news stories in recent weeks that just really show the urgency of the sort of anti-gender, far-right activity around the world. Starting with, as you say, the passing of this very serious anti-LGBT law in Uganda. Back in November, I was reporting on this issue and was looking at the sort of spend of US Christian nationalist groups in sub-Saharan Africa. And I was really lucky enough to talk to one of the only pro-LGBT MPs in the Ugandan parliament. And it's just a really, I think what most people have found very shocking is that this is kind of a rewind of the news from over a decade ago. That around 10 years ago, there was a push to kind of introduce a death penalty for LGBT people in Uganda. And it was, a lot of American activity, a lot of people kind of pushing this really hateful ideology about LGBT people. And then it didn't happen, which was great. The human rights won the day. But as I was talking to the lawyers and MPs last year, just because wasn't the law, just because it wasn't in the headlines, it never went away. That hate never went away. And people went back and they re-strategized and they came up with a new plan and they kept pushing and pushing and pushing. So last year we saw some really horrific homophobic activity in Uganda that kind of culminated in the shutdown of the Sexual Minorities Uganda group that was run by Frank Mugisha, with people making really nasty, unfounded claims about what the organization did. And of course, that allowed more and more hate to build up, which then allowed for this law to be tabled and then eventually to be passed. And I think it's a really frightening time for LGBT people in the region, but also globally. We're seeing this kind of attack on LGBTIQ rights in the UK. We're seeing it obviously in the States with, starting with Ron DeSantis's Don't Say Gay law last year or the year before.
It was last year. Yeah.
We're seeing these sort of anti-drag legislation that we're seeing coming in across American states. And in next door to Uganda, in Kenya, they're now trying to push, I think it's called a family protection bill, which again is kind of pushing these anti-gender ideologies, this idea that, LGBT people should have the few rights that they do currently have rolled back. and abortion rights, again, very restricted in this region, but becoming even more restrictive.
And before you talk about the Poland incident, can you tell us, because you got to go to Kenya, and can you tell us what you discovered when you were able to travel there? Because I think it's very important when people are boots on the ground that they bring us the intel.
So yeah, I was lucky enough to go to Kenya last June. So yeah, nearly a year ago. And what I was looking at, and what I was really interested in, is the involvement of organizations from the global north in sub-Saharan Africa when it comes to abortion rights, when it comes to LGBT rights. So I was particularly looking at an organization called Citizen Go, which is based in Spain, but which has a global outreach and is active in the US, active in the UK, and apparently is coming to Australia, I was told the other week. So what I was really curious about was how these, Western sort of global north organizations were getting involved in debates in sub-Saharan Africa in order to influence how people thought about abortion and how people thought about LGBTIQ rights. And it's a really worrying pattern. The issue that we're seeing in Uganda is, for example, is very linked to US Christian nationalist organizations and sort of right-wing organizations. So Family Watch International, which is run by an American woman called Sharon Slater, has been very active in Uganda since, the late noughties, early 2010s. As I say, in Kenya, Citizen Go is very active. And they really push this message, and this is the thing that really bothers me. They push this message that abortion rights and LGBT people and LGBT rights are somehow un-African, and that the notion that we should have reproductive health care, the notion that LGBT people should have rights, is a Western imposition in a form of neo-colonialism.
Wow.
And obviously in countries that are former, colonies because of the British Empire and the terrible destruction and harm done by the British Empire throughout history, that's a very emotive thing to talk about in places like Kenya. But of course, what this ignores is Family Watch International is a US organization. Citizen Go is a Spanish organization. These organizations that are Western, like global North groups, imposing their ideology in the region. And so I think there's a real hypocrisy going on when we look at the activities of these groups in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and in other parts of the world.
Wow. Okay. So now let's get to the urgency. We had, as you know, because this is the stuff that we reported on over and over again, we had a terrible example of what happens when you take away women's healthcare rights and girls' healthcare rights. When a 10-year-old had to be flown out of state, a live factory was built around all of this. But when you say there's a new incident in Poland, I'm still recovering from the last incident in Poland. What is happening there that our viewers should know about?
So last week, there were reports in Polish media that another woman had died of organ failure following sepsis after as a result of not being able to access reproductive health care. So obviously, this is like a live investigation. There's lots of moving parts, but what this sort of suggests is that when she was in hospital, she was about 20 weeks pregnant. Her amniotic sac burst. And because of the really stringent anti-abortion laws in Poland, that there's a lot of uncertainty about when to treat, when to intervene, having this what they call the watching position. So this is the fourth time this has happened since Poland tightened its anti-abortion laws in 2021. First, there was a woman called Anya, who we don't know very much about. There was a woman called Isabella and Agnieszka, and now this woman, Dorota. And so we've seen at least 4 women lose their lives as a result of the kind of restrictions on abortion in the country, or at least linked to those restrictions. And this is something that we're familiar with. This is what happened in Ireland in 2012. And Savita Halap-Havana lost her life because she was denied as reproductive health care, sepsis leading to organ failure. This is what happens. This is what happens when you deny women their rights over their own body.
Right.
This was going to be her first child. She was 33 years old.
I'm going to have the guys jump in, but I want to say that it was the work I was doing with you where I first understood 2 things: that this was about healthcare rights.
Yeah.
And we don't frame it that way. We've been allowing the words of the propagandists, like the late term abortion. What is the phrase that Trump had always used? That partial birth abortion, or that doesn't even, that's not even, that's propaganda language. And we've been allowing the propagandists to set the language for this. But we're talking about women's health care. And the other thing that I discovered when I was reporting with you was how embedded racism has always been in this, particularly here in America. I'd like the guys to jump in, and then there's some other stuff I want to talk about.
I was really interested in what you said about the propaganda in Africa and how they were using sort of colonial fear mongering, right? It sounds very evocative of Dugin's and Putin's propaganda in the U.S. that's designed to divide. I'm wondering, other than obviously the American Christian organizations, what other sort of influences do you see in terms of disinformation and propaganda there?
So I can't really talk about that from the African perspective, because my research in Kenya was really focused on sort of Western and European disinformation. But from a European perspective, we know that Russian disinformation has been really fundamental in looking at anti-gender movements and influencing the sort of anti-abortion and anti-gender debates that have been going on. So Neil Datta, who's a fantastic genius man who I owe a huge debt for his research, he put together a report called Tip of the Iceberg, which looked at the kind of funding streams of anti-gender activism in Europe. And obviously Russia was the third biggest funders. But we also don't know for sure how much with Russia, because a lot of the money is so dark. But what he was able to look at, we know that Russia was the third biggest funder in the region of kind of anti-gender groups, anti-abortion groups, anti-LGBT organizing. We also know that one of Putin's kind of close allies, Konstantin Malofeev, ran a sort of anti-gender propaganda machine from Russia. So he ran a TV station called Tsargrad, which would feature people like Alex Jones. Alexander Dugin, as far as I can recall, was like the creative director or some editorial director, like very involved with it, basically.
Right.
And he and another oligarch called Yakunin were also involved in organizing a big conference, sort of anti-gender conference that brought together all the leading sort of anti-abortion lights. Which was because the World Congress of Families, which is a global anti-abortion, anti-LGBT conference, was supposed to take place in Russia. But then because this was around 2014 and there were sanctions after the first invasion, so it didn't happen and they just organized another one. But I think it's really interesting. I think there's been a lot of, obviously we're so much more aware of Russian disinformation now because of the 2016 election, because of debates about Brexit. But I think, abortion and LGBT rights is a really key area for Russian disinformation, because it is where it can sow seeds of division and kind of pit the sort of, liberal metropolitan elite, progressive Europe against that kind of more traditional, anti-human rights sort of characters in Europe. So it's really concerning. And I don't think we should ever dismiss the strength and invisibility of what Russia is up to.
And what's so important about that is you and I reported on how Jack Hannock, who was a former Fox producer and director associated with Hannity during his rise, went to go work for Malofeev, went to go build out these Russian propaganda lie factory media stations. And then he got picked up in the UK and sent to prison, and it's still going through the judicial process right now. The other important thing about what Jim just brought up is Cambridge Analytica, as we know, had quite an impact in Africa, and in fact, so much so that Kenya had to do a redo on its election, which we couldn't do here in America. I don't know what was wrong with us. Kenya could make the decision that they were manipulated through Cambridge Analytica's lie factory and marketing. And so it's what you just brought up is so incredibly important, and that is still invisible And thanks to all the work people like you are doing, maybe less so, is also just really incredibly important. High five.
So one of the things I like to, pay attention to is networks, and specifically networks that move money back and forth between countries over national borders, right? And one of the things I've noticed is there's a couple Silicon Valley CEO, oligarch, chairman of the board types who have, publicly proclaimed about, oh, we're funding a school in Kenya, or we're funding a church in Kenya. We're sponsoring these things. And one thing that happened recently, I don't know if you know anything about this, but I do want to, bring it up because I think it leads into what we're seeing in Africa is, Bishop David Kodia of the Anglican Church was recently raided under allegations of money laundering. Know anything about that and how that could tie into the disinformation?
No, it's not something I picked up on. But yeah, I think we just always need to be really aware about where money is flowing and what influence it hopes to achieve. Because of course, one of the things I talk about a lot about this book is, I look a lot at these sort of transnational networks, these international organizations and groups working with each other across borders. And then I always point out, but we do that too on the left, we do that as human rights activists. It's like we fund things across the world and help build toilets and, help build schools. Like there's nothing fundamentally wrong with transnational organizing and, funding initiatives. It's what you hope to get out of it. And what influence you hope to exert and who you're trying to buy influence from. And that can be from a benign place, like I just want to build a water pump in a village that doesn't have any water, to kind of get that foothold in a region so that you can start influencing its politics and its business.
Which is terrifying. We know how we've been reporting for years on this show, Wagner's influence in Africa, more and more terrifying by the day, in my opinion. So let's go back to the beginning on your book. And let's talk about the place of women in fascist thought. I think it's really important we start with the origins of this, the origins of the extremism, misogyny, trad wife, all of that.
Yeah. So I wanted to sort of start the book. Here it is.
Hey, hold it up one more time so we can use that as our promo picture. Yeah, that's it. I love it.
So I wanted, before sort of diving into the investigations and that side of things, I thought it was important to have a chapter that sets the scene, as you say, about women's position in fascist ideology. And I think there's sort of three really important sort of pillars of fascist ideology that I explore in the first chapter. The first one is that there's this natural order, that the world, humanity is governed by nature, and that there's no such thing as rationalism or science. It's like we're all animals sort of narrative. And in this natural order, men are superior, women are inferior, white people are superior, Black and global majority people are inferior, and LGBT people just don't exist. They don't come into it. And I think it's that kind of, once you understand that is how women are seen, as these kind of inferior figures to male supremacy, it unlocks an awful lot of understanding about where abortion fits in. Because in the natural order, a woman's role is pinned to reproduction. That's what you are there for. That is your role, and that is you, and you are obeying nature by having lots and lots of babies. And it's really interesting, actually, because I wrote a piece about trad wives last week for The Guardian, and then I got this comment being like, "You hate nature." I was
like, can I note that Elon Musk is one of the people who follows along with these lines and advocates openly for having as many kids as possible. Well, please continue. Apologies for interrupting.
No, I had the same thought. Thank you, Jim. I was thinking the same thing.
So the second pillar is this thing called the fascist mythic past. And this is an idea, again, that there was this point in an imagined history. It's not real, where the natural order was running just fine. And so in this mythic past, women knew their place. And again, women's place was to reproduce. And then the final thing is this idea that we need to have a constant state of war, and that we always need to be engaged in some kind of warfare, this kind of existential battle for white male supremacy. And in the war, men's role is to be the fighter and on the battleground, and the women's battleground is, once again, reproduction. And so it's really like, if you understand these kind of 3 pillars of fascist ideology and how, according to each of them, a woman's place is in the domestic, it's, sort of barefoot and pregnant, basically, then you can understand why abortion is such an anathema to them, because abortion is usurping the natural order. It's saying that women don't have to be inferior to men. It's saying that women can have control over their own bodies and their own destinies, and that women's role can be bigger and wider than being pinned to reproduction. Of course, like, most women have children. Most women want to have children. Having children is a really positive, wonderful thing. But the idea that women's sole purpose is to have children in order to serve kind of patriarchal authority or white supremacy is very different from, celebrating motherhood, or being really happy for your best friend when she announces she's pregnant, or being really happy for yourself when you announce you're pregnant. So it's really about thinking about women's roles in this kind of icky natural order, in this mythic past. And you see the mythic past stuff everywhere, like on incel forums. They're always like, talk about this golden age when every man was guaranteed a wife, and you're like, all right. It never happened. It didn't exist.
One of our viewers sent me this note about how he looks at Hitler as sort of the original incel, or maybe it was Jim actually extrapolating that. But it's very interesting that so much of this originates 100 years ago, and how defective so many of the originators were. And, in my lifetime, I celebrated all the things that we fought for: feminism, civil rights, gay rights, all of that. And this reversal in course, funded by the dark money that you follow, is what we have to try to stop immediately.
I mean, but I think it's really important to point that thing out. Like, as you say, we've lived through this incredible, moment of women's liberation. Like, we won a lot of stuff. Like, I talk to my friends who are in second wave feminism, and they talk about when they couldn't get a mortgage. You had to have, your husband was the only person who was allowed to get a mortgage. You couldn't get a credit card if you were married, because your husband had to approve it. She's in her 70s now. It's not that long ago. So, but I think this is the point. Whenever there is a moment of women gaining freedoms, of women having some kind of political power, we see this backlash against reproductive rights. We saw it in 1860s USA, and that was when the sort of first bans on abortion really, kicked in. We saw it in Mussolini's Italy. Women had been kind of gaining some kind of political and social power, particularly post-World War I, when everything sort of shifted. Definitely see it in 1930s Germany. So 1920s Germany, women were getting a lot more sexual power, particularly a lot more economic. There was a resurgence of women's movements, and then bam, 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 every single time you get a shift, you get a few more rights, you get a little bit of progress, and it's like, right, we're coming for your reproductive rights.
So I'm of the mindset that women's reproductive rights are human rights.
Yeah.
Same as trans rights, gay rights, the rights of minorities, right? To not be abused. And one of the things we've seen in this bizarre information social media sphere is a virulently transphobic movie that was put out by some incel, but it has been promoted by Elon Musk. And as the owner of the social media site, it seems to me that he is utilizing his platform to attack human rights.
Yeah.
And like, how do we even get accountability for such an egregious act?
I mean, it's really frightening, isn't it? I mean, it's surreal to watch, because Twitter was a place where, for all its faults and for all its, responsibility for pushing disinformation and misogynistic and far-right narratives, it was also a place where people could express themselves, perhaps particularly minoritized communities or marginalized communities had like a free space where they could talk about and form communities online, and then maybe go and have alt accounts where you go and chat with your new community. And for it suddenly to become like the plaything of a billionaire who doesn't have any understanding of human rights, and his only understanding is that he wants to trash them, is scary, because what you see now on Twitter has always had problems. I mean, I've been on Twitter since 2009 and I've had horrific abuse in that time.
Yeah.
But it's the giving priority to abuse that we're now seeing, that, and I just think it's going to die. I can't see Twitter surviving. It'll just become
It's already become, as Jim always says, we're behind enemy lines. It's already become a Russian propaganda outlet. I want to, because we've actually, yes, go ahead, Jim.
I just wanted to follow up on this. What you're describing is really important, and I just want to reemphasize: misogyny can lead to the worst possible outcomes, right? Genocide, eugenics, etc., right? Because when you have exactly the kind of structure that you're talking about, male white supremacist, what follows from that, the enforcement of that ideology is genocide. There is no other way of sort of expressing that idea in the world. And I just wanted to take a moment to kind of let that sink in, that it's not just about women's rights, as important as that is, right?
Yeah.
It's that women's rights are being weaponized to attack everyone who isn't in the in-group in this situation, which includes LGBTQ plus people, includes minorities, includes Jews, includes everybody who doesn't fit into their worldview. And that's why this fight is so important, and why what you're writing about is so important. I just wanted to say that.
And I think it's really important as well to recognize that, like, misogyny is the gateway drug for a lot of these white supremacists. Like, it's a way of radicalizing particularly young men into a hateful ideology. And because most young men will have some kind of grievance against women, because we all have grievances against people, and maybe there's that girl who didn't snog you at the disco, or or your mum's really annoying, and it's like, it's very easy to kind of ratchet up a grievance against someone that you do know, and then extend it into like hatred against women, and then that into hatred against everyone else. And if you spend as much time on incel websites as I do, you see it. You see the way that it goes from extremist misogyny to extreme racism very, very quickly, and how normalized white supremacy and racism is on these spaces. And it's really, if we don't look at, and that's why I'm so passionate about this issue, because if we don't look at how misogyny is weaponized and used to groom and radicalize men into hateful ideologies, then we can't stop we can't stop the kind of rise of the far right. If we only look at things in silos and don't see that pipeline and that pathway, then we can't ever find ways of preventing it, because we're coming in too late.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Another mic drop from Sharn. Jim said, when Roe was overturned, as much as you and I prophesized that it was coming, Jim said the very first episode of RadPod after that, he said, so now they're coming for gay rights. Now that's, so we know this pattern. So that's exactly so. So I'm just going to read a quick thing from one of our articles from a year ago, The Long Backlash Against Abortion in America, because it dovetails with this conversation. The white supremacist backlash. Alongside male supremacy, and a misogynistic backlash, white supremacy and a racist backlash are crucial to understanding the attacks on abortion rights in the U.S. The far right's objection to abortion is fueled by the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which claims that white people in the U.S. are being replaced by migrant people from the global South. And then we talk about how it's not new. In the 1860s, U.S. anti-abortion voices called to ban the procedure due to concerns about rising migration and a low WASP birth rate. So it's fascinating that all of this can really be prophesized by history. We can look and see, yes, we have new technologies and all of this. And like what you just said, we can't stop it if we can't even properly diagnose it. But I think it's very important that all of this misogyny, the white supremacy, and the racism is all part of the cocktail that is right now, being mixed together to take away human rights. And they will come for everybody, which is why it's so important that it stops here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also really important to recognize that it's a shared fight.
Yeah, right. Wow. I just want to get back to the tipping point. Which future do we choose? Can you make an argument to our global viewers why we have to choose the future we choose and how we go about doing it?
So I wanted to make that point at the end of the book, particularly because for so many people, Roe was a shock. And Dobbs is obviously the name of the ruling, but we'll kind of talk about it as Roe. And that idea that, people sort of just took it for granted that it wouldn't happen, that abortion rights were secure, that we'd had these battles in the 70s and the 60s. And once things start going forward, they don't go backwards again. And so I think the sort of shock that was met, particularly by people in the UK, who maybe it was slightly different in the US, when Dobbs came in, was just like, actually you need to pay attention and you need to fight. You need to choose to fight for your human rights. You can't just expect things to always be okay and always be settled, because they won't be. And so I think I wanted to make that point at the end of the book, that we have to choose, because we know that there's so many multi-crises happening at the moment. The climate crisis, the ongoing, I'm obsessed with 2008, but the ongoing fallout of 2008, how that's kind of been linked to the rise of the far right, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the sort of destabilization of the global order that was precipitated by Trump, and which thankfully has been rebalanced a little bit, but is always feeling a bit more fragile than it did perhaps 10 years ago. And, ongoing conflicts all around the world. So there's lots and lots of pressure points. There's lots of things happening when there's often been this trend that women's rights are okay when things are fine, and I think that's why I talk a little bit about the late 90s, early noughties in the UK. It was like we had a lot of sort of positive moves for women's rights because we could afford to, because everything was kind of okay and things were getting better. And it was like, okay, well, your turn has come, ladies. But then as soon as there's crisis, as soon as there's uncertainty, as soon as things are rocked, it's women's rights that's are very easy to slip, because they're seen as a luxury. They're not seen as a right. Wow. And so while we face all of these crises, and of course, I didn't even mention the pandemic, which was, it's like so much has gone on. When we've got all of these crises going on, that's when rights are at their most vulnerable, because people cling to old certainties, such as male supremacy. They cling to old certainties such as racism and war. And they don't want these kind of newfangled abortion rights that women have been banging on about. They want to go back. They want to regress. And so we have to recognize that is a possibility, and therefore know that we have to fight for our rights and keep fighting and keep demanding them, because they can be taken away, and they were taken away.
Yes, they were, and that was a big win for fascism, because you took away the rights of half the population. Wow. Yes, high five.
So Paul Mason, about your book, says, Norris traces the networks that are pushing bigotry into the heads of young men across the world and shows how they interact with the respectable right. And I would offer the fact that when you have, Donald Trump meeting with Nick Fuentes and Kanye West, who has gone
off the rails.
Off the rails. When you see these misogynists and these hate mongers platformed by respectable institutions, it seems to me that alters people's view of what's acceptable behavior. And as such, if they are influential enough, if they have a large enough platform, they can actually shift the current of society. And that's kind of what we're seeing here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's the kind of purpose of the book as well, is to show how extremist ideas about women and women's bodies have moved out of the kind of dark corners of the internet and into mainstream politics. And you're absolutely right. If you've got someone from an anti-abortion, anti-LGBT group saying things that you would normally, or saying the sentiments, not necessarily the exact language, but the sentiments and the ideology of extremists, but they're doing it in front of the UN, you start to think, oh, well, I mean, it must be kind of okay because they're at the UN. Like, it wouldn't, this can't be unacceptable because the UN wouldn't allow it if it was. A couple of weeks ago in the UK, we had this National Conservatism Conference, which is linked to the Edmund Burke Foundation, I want to say, one of the US groups anyway, and they hosted it in the UK. And suddenly, this was a conference that a couple of years ago a Conservative MP went to and was told off. Like, he was rebuked for his presence at this conference because it was seen as like an unacceptable space because people were talking about cultural Marxism and riffing off Great Replacement theory, and it was all just a bit like distasteful. And they might not be using the racist language, but they're using the racist ideas. And this time, similar sentiments being expressed, similar ideologies being expressed, but the Home Secretary is one of the keynote speakers. So these ideas have become more and more normalized. They've become laundered by think tanks, by people in smart suits, by respectable campaigners who go to European Parliament, who go to the United Nations. And then they become normalized even further by politicians going, oh, well, yeah, the problem is that we're not having enough babies. And so that's a scary thing. If, like I say at the beginning of the book, if this was all happening on red pill forums and incel forums, I'd be interested in it because I find that kind of interesting and scary, and I want to talk about it. But you could sleep at night. The fact that these ideas are now being parroted by people who actually have power because they've been presented to them by people who have a little bit more power than oddballs on the internet is why we need to pay attention and why we need to wake up to it.
And all I want to posit, because that was very important, all I want to say is that the wonderful news, and I do like to leave with good news, is there has been a tremendous backlash. 2/3 of America did not want Roe overturned. States that people are calling red, which is an old paradigm and doesn't work, are actually showing that this is very unpopular. The GOP, some of them had to walk back some of the things they said, worrying that they were going to lose, and some of them did in our most recent vote. So the Republicans have risked quite a voter backlash because 2/3 of America, and that includes Republican women, do not want healthcare rights taken away. So we have seen from Wisconsin to Tennessee, all over, we are actually seeing a backlash to taking away half the country's healthcare rights. So I'm hoping that I'm right about that. And let's just give you the last word. Anything that you want to say?
Well, I want to end on that hopeful note, right? Because it is true. Abortion bans aren't popular. Women dying in hospital beds is not popular policy. And that is what happens, as we know from Poland, and the 20,000 women who lose their lives to unsafe abortion every year. That's what happens when you ban abortion. But I remember just after Dobbs, I did a piece about, the response, and spoke to the Centre for Reproductive Rights in Switzerland and Leah Hochter. And she said to me that since 1973, I think it was 53 states have improved access to abortion, and only 4 have rolled them back. And so the direction is in the right direction. Countries have been liberalizing abortion laws in the last 5 years that you never thought would. I mean, Ireland in 2018, Argentina, the sort of discussions in Colombia, in Chile, like these are countries that are taking really profound action to ensure women's human rights are protected. And that is the direction of travel. So we have to hold on to that. And obviously, number 4 was the US. But the US isn't the world.
Wow. Well, the book is Bodies Under Siege, How the Far-Right Attack on Reproductive Rights Went Global. This is Sian Norris. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And please come back as frequently as possible to bring us the news.
Absolutely. I'm always happy to be back.
Thank you so much, Sian.
Thank you.